Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about the cell structure. So we're going to be talking about the different organelles that are found within the cell and what is their function. And we're also going to be talking about antibiotics. How do antibiotics work? How are they able to treat bacterial infections? Specifically, we're also going to be talking about Dr. Alexander Fleming. So Dr. Alexander Fleming was the first person to actually use an antibiotic. In this case, we were talking about penicillin to actually treat bacterial infections. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how penicillin was discovered. So Dr. Alexander Fleming was testing different compounds to see if they would stop bacterial growth, but not none of them were working. So in this petri dish, he was basically eyeing the nutrients the bacteria needs in order to grow. And then in this petri dish, he was also putting the bacteria. So you see these kind of like lines that are all over the petri dish that are basically bacteria. And then within this dish, he was adding different compounds to see if they were basically preventing bacteria to grow, but nothing was working. So he had his black bench full of these petri dishes. He was very frustrated, and the story goes that he was basically gonna throw all those dishes away. And when he was about to throw away the last petri dish, he noticed something that was very interesting. So in this particular petri dish, you see kind of like a really white a round thing, and that is basically penicillin. And so next to the penicillin, you see kind of like a ring where there's no bacterial growth. So that caught the attention of Dr. Alexander Fleming, and actually he repeated this same experiment, and every single time he was getting the same results. Near where the penicillin was, there was no bacterial growth, and essentially he knew he had discovered something that was going to change the world. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about antibiotics. So let's break down the word antibiotic. So anti means against, biotic means life. So technically, antibiotics are anti-life. So what is an antibiotic? So an antibiotic is a chemical that actually stops or slows down the growth of bacteria. A lot of times what happens is that these chemicals are produced by other living organisms as in a way to protect themselves. In this case, when we're talking about penicillin, it's actually produced by Penicillium notatum, which is basically a fungus. And I often tell my students that the solution to every single problem, to every single disease, nature has already the solution. And it is up to us to actually find those and use them for our benefit. So now the beautiful part about antibiotics is that they actually kill the bacteria without harming the human cells, without harming basically your cells. And the reason for that is because they specifically bind and target what is unique to the bacterial cells. And in a minute, we're going to be talking about what specifically do antibiotics target. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the cell theory. The cell theory states that all living organisms are made out of cells, and that every new cell comes from the division of pre-existing cells. And this is kind of like the chicken or the egg kind of question, because what was before the first cell? According to this theory, it says that every new cell comes from the division of pre-existing cells. All right, so cells come in different sizes and shapes. So in this case, I'm looking at a red blood cell, and the main function of a red blood cell is to carry oxygen throughout my body. And one important fact about red blood cells is that it doesn't have a nucleus. Next, we have an amoeba, which is basically a single cell eukaryotic organism. And next to the amoeba, we have a bacteria, which is basically a single cell prokaryotic organism. Now, bacteria are super small, so you actually need a microscope in order to look at the bacteria. However, they are mighty powerful. they can actually make you really, really sick. And then we have molds or fungi, which can be single cell or multicellular. And next to the mold, we actually have a plant cell. So plant cells are multicellular eukaryotic organism. And I don't know if you guys noticed that a bunch of little green circles. Basically, that's chloroplast that the plant uses in order to do photosynthesis. And we'll talk about photosynthesis later in the semester. And the last type of cell, which is my favorite one, is basically neurons. So these are found in your brain. These are basically the cells that allow you to, to learn, to dream, and to do any of the functions that we associate with being human. So there are two main types of cells: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So let me tell you one very important difference between the cells. Prokaryotic cells, they do not have what we call membrane-bound organelles. So these are basically the organelles that are found within the membrane. So they're basically bound there, if you will. And the second important difference is that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. This is in contrast to eukaryotic cells, which actually have many membrane-bound organelles, and they also have a nucleus. Again, the main difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and they also don't have membrane-bound organelles. Now, there are several things that prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells have in common. So the first thing is that both cells have a cell membrane that is made out of phospholipids or fats and also proteins. The second thing is that they have a cytoplasm, which is kind of like the liquid portion within the cell where you find some of the organelles. They also have ribosomes. So these are the organelles that are important for making proteins. Even though they both have ribosomes, the size of these ribosomes are actually different between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And that is extremely important. And we'll talk about this later. And the last thing is that both prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells actually have genetic material. In this case, we're going to be talking about DNA. Alright, so now let's talk about some of the differences. So in the case of eukaryotic cells, they actually have a nucleus. And within the nucleus, you actually find the DNA. The second thing is that eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles, or many membrane-bound organelles. This is in contrast to prokaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells, they do not have a nucleus. They do have DNA. The DNA is just basically floating within the cell itself. And the second thing is that prokaryotic cells, they do not have membrane-bound organelles. They do have certain organelles, such as, for example, ribosomes, right? But they are not membrane-bound. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how do antibiotics work, specifically how does penicillin works. So bacteria, they actually have an outer coating that we call the bacterial cell wall. So the bacterial cell wall is made out of a compound called peptidoglycan. So peptidoglycan is actually made out of many sugars and amino acids that are bonded together. And essentially, peptidoglycan, what it does is that it allows the bacteria to actually survive under moist condition, so under basically water, if you will. Okay, because bacteria, they don't actually like water, but because they have the bacterial cell wall, it allows it to survive in these conditions.